I like doing this because it's like counter programming. You know, I could talk about cancel culture right now. I could talk about Bernie Sanders' sham task force with Joe Biden being released. I could talk about coronavirus.
Yeah.
You know, I could talk about any number of things, but instead, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff. But we are going to talk about something that is incredibly relevant to our current times. Sorry, what were you saying?
Well, I do briefly want to talk for a moment about cancel culture, Jeff. I would like to create a culture canceling capitalism.
Boom.
That's why I'm here.
Oh, hell yeah. We're going to try to cancel capitalism. And honestly, you know, my vision for this episode is to try to explain why capitalism needs canceling. And I wanted to start with something like this that I was thinking about. When I talk about capitalism a lot on this show, on Twitter, when I think about it a lot, probably when a lot of people on the left think about it, they think about it as a political system more than an economic system. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, you know, to examine how, for example, large concentrations of capital fund elections, buy ad time for campaigns, influence through lobbying, straight up break the law to increase their profits, et cetera, like, you know, all that's relevant, interesting. But we're not going to talk so much about that today. I just want to talk about capitalism more as an economic system, as a mode of production. You dig what I'm saying, Kenny?
Oh, we talking modes here? Let's go.
We're talking
modes?
I mean, we're not
getting
gonna
real
go,
moded up here.
We're not gonna go through the ladder, okay? But just talking about the capitalist mode of production, we're gonna ignore the feudal, the ancient, the Asiatic, the very contentious Asiatic mode of production, all of that. Just think about capitalist mode of production, our mode of production today. And generally speaking, it goes something like this: if you need a thing, then you buy a thing, and that's how you get the thing. And the reason it works that way is because we live in a culture where products are produced to be purchased and consumed. They are not produced for use. In other words, we sell shoes for people to buy. Once they buy them, whether they wear them or not is frankly of no concern to the person who sells them the shoes. We don't actually make shoes for people to put on their feet in any way. You know, I think this is a good way of saying.
Yeah, I mean, I would also throw in there that, like, if you've grown up in the 21st century, if you're listening to this podcast right now, your entire life has been, in some way, shape, or form, mediated by the purchase or sale of commodities, the purchase and sale of your labor power.
And how more and more spheres of your life are governed by this dynamic. There are a few exceptions to this, like with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, things like this. But generally speaking, if you need a thing, you don't go to a government office. You have to buy the thing. At least that's the easiest way to get your hands around it, right? So the capitalist mode of production is really not about producing for use, but producing for profit. With all that being said, we need to talk about the Big Daddy, the grandfather, right, of all of this. A guy who I am frankly pretty intimidated by even now. And hence why, even though I'm pretty familiar with him and I've read him, I don't talk about him too much on the show, especially in terms of his more academic work, which is what we're about to do right now. But we all know who it is. It's Marx. It's Karl fucking Marx, right? We're actually going to talk about Karl fucking Marx.
It's finally happening.
It's finally fucking happening. So we don't have time to go through a whole bio on Karl Marx or whatever, but one thing I wanted to say about Karl Marx...
German philosophy, there you go.
Boom. Done. He was a German philosopher. That's it.
All you need to know. It's fine.
All you know. But one thing I would say about it,
we're not going to talk about his 400-page rant about Max Max Stirner. Okay.
or any of the other like sort of pecuniary issues. The guy wrote a lot, which is kind of my point. He wrote a lot of stuff for a lot of different audiences. He was a very gifted writer too, just independent of being a thinker, I'd say.
He's the original, like he had the original poster spirit.
Exactly.
Like I joked a moment ago about Max Stirner, but Karl Marx was the type of guy who wrote 3 times more critiquing Max Stirner than Max Stirner ever wrote in his entire life. And that's not like a throwaway joke. Like Max Stirner wrote like a 100-page book, and Marx devoted 300 to 400 pages, basically like arguing against the guy because he hated him so much.
um, but the thing with Marx's writing is that when people tell you to read Marx, you absolutely should. But I think you should be cautioned that not all of his output is for the same audience. And Capital, Volume
No.
1, 2, and 3 can be a difficult thing to get your head around, partially because it was really originally written in German, I think, but partially because like it's just very dense, and it's very difficult to figure out exactly what is being conveyed. It just takes some time to get through. Whereas something like the Communist Manifesto is eminently readable. You know, it very pretty short.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
it's great.
it certainly doesn't help that he died in the process of writing Capital. So you have Capital Volume One, which, um, if you're an incredibly boring person like I am, is like really fun to read. And then he dies, and so you get volumes 2 and 3, which are just collections of his notes. Which is like, oh, if you thought Volume One was boring, let's just literally have his notes.
Yeah, it gets even harder after that, which like Ingles did his best. And shout out to our man Ingles for sure. Because otherwise we probably would never even nobody would even get to read Capital Volume 3. And in particular, that volume has a lot about what I'm about to introduce now, which is that now that we've got Marx in the mode of production that he's analyzed as capitalist, and we've described somewhat what it is, I want to talk about a really lame sounding thing that leads to something that sounds a lot more cool and serious. That cool and serious thing is crisis theory, which is a huge school of Marxian and Marxist thought, both politically and economically, um, concerning capitalism's tendency to collapse. And we'll talk way more about that in a second.
Yeah.
But the boring thing is something called the tendency for the rate of profit to decline. Do you want to give a shot at explaining what the tendency for the rate of profit to decline is, Kitty? And then I'll see if I can add anything.
Yeah, I think just really briefly to give my spin on things. Um, I I came to learn about this during the 2008 financial crisis, and I think for a lot of people of our generation, it was like, "Oh, everything's falling apart. Why is it falling apart?" And it turns out, of the handful of people to talk about capitalism to this day, Marx gives you an explanation. He explains that there is a tendency in capitalism for this thing he calls the general rate of profit to fall or to decline. And when it does that, it throws the entire economic system into crisis. Um, it's worth noting that this wasn't Marx's idea. He wasn't the first one to come up with it. It comes from Adam Smith and David Ricardo. But the core intuition of the idea is, if we think about an economic system like capitalism, where you have firms competing with one another, and you think about that in its kind of ideal state, then what you have is firms competing with one another to replace human workers, which Marx situates as the source of profit. That profit is actually not derived from trade, but derived in production. And if actual human laborers are the source of profit, then in the long run, as capitalists and as businesses seek to replace workers with machinery and automation, then what you end up having is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall across the entire economy because they are replacing human labor power with machinery. And machinery is, uh, uh, does what it says on the tin. It can't create more value than it's worked on. So as that happens, the rate of profit falls.
Because over time, what this will mean is that as different industries mature, there will be more capital required to break into that industry and be competitive. For example, like today, if I wanted to make a living making and selling shoes, I can't compete with Nike in a lot of different ways. Their supplies are way cheaper than I can get them for. Their labor, because they work in third world or undeveloped countries or underdeveloped countries, excuse me, um, they don't have to pay as much, whereas I have to pay myself, and I want to like pay a living wage. I also don't have the machinery, importantly, to bang out, I don't know, 1,000 shoes a day or 10,000 shoes a day or anything like that. Like all I have is my hands and whatever tools I can get a hold of with the money in my bank account, which is, I won't tell you exactly how much, but not very much. And so the thing is like anybody who wants to get into the shoe making business is going to have a sufficient level of capital to even be competitive. And over time, as industries and economies develop, this problem is inescapable. Now, like you said, Marx is not the first person to notice this. So, which, like, ironically, makes me baffled that people still to this day will tell you that this concept isn't real or isn't a problem, which is a lot. Maybe not the majority these days. I think this economics itself is a pretty sloppy state of affairs in terms of its rigor. But because we've been in such crisis moments for so long that the dominant schools of thought just can't respond to. But I done rambled on enough about this, I think. But we should talk about some of the counteracting tendencies, right? That capitalism employs
Yeah.
around this.
And just to your previous point about, if you wanted to get into the shoemaking business, um, if you've ever watched the show Shark Tank, this topic actually comes up quite a bit because a lot of small business owners, they'll go on Shark Tank, they're trying to get an investment. And one of the most, I'm sorry, I watch a lot of Shark Tank, if that's not obvious. But one of the most common complaints on that show is people saying, look, I'm a small business. I can't buy 10,000 units from my supplier. If I could buy 10,000 units, they would give me a better price. But because I can only buy 1,000 units, they charge me a higher price. And so it's uncompetitive for them to try to do what they're doing unless they have that investment to buy 10,000 units.
I'm really glad you brought that specifically up because it reminds me of something I forgot to add, which is that one reason you can tell this is true, I think, in the real world is it's very obvious. Since capitalism has really taken off, post-Civil War, let's say in the United States, the trend towards consolidation and vertical and horizontal integration in businesses, i.e., like companies getting bigger and bigger and bigger and all across all kinds of industries. Like it was true in the late 19th century. It was true in the early 20th century. It was true during the New Deal. It was true after the New Deal. Like this trend in capitalism as it's progressing in America, like you'd be a fool not to deny it, right?
Well, and when it comes to consolidation, if you looked at what's going on in the tech sphere and been like, how are these companies that regularly lose money still getting investors? Well, the reason they still get investors is the idea that they will be able to be um, dominant or monopolistic at some point. Uber regularly loses money. It bleeds money just every single day. but people keep investing in it in the idea that it's going to be able to replace transportation and shipping. Like, that's why that company is able to lose money every single year, yet still attract billionaires every single year.
Because as this phenomenon progresses, the avenue for profitable investment will fall unless you employ a few tricks that capitalism has up its sleeve.
These 5 easy tricks
You know,
no one wants to tell you about.
no one wants to tell you about, but you're not going to like them. There's one point I want to make before I even get into any of this, which is that every one of the tricks we're about to talk about, and we're not going to talk about all of them probably, that capitalism uses to escape this problem, they're all finite. Like, none of them are sustainable.
Yeah.
On a planet that is, of limited size like we have. So, but one thing that you can do is say, because this constant quest to escape the falling rate of profit, what do companies do to get around this? Well, one thing they can do is they can try to lower their labor costs. And if they can't do it in the country in which they were founded,
this is one of Marx's most complicated insights. If you think about it, he's like, "Hey, so you need to maintain a certain rate of. What if you just paid?" It's a really like deep insight, isn't it?
So what tends to happen is like the productive forces themselves get relocated to countries with lower standards of living, i.e., where labor costs are lower, and the government makes it easier to keep the labor situation oppressed. They can also straight up steal or get at a better price through imperialist wars resources and reduce the inputs that it takes to make their product, i.e., like make oil for them cheaper, for example, to make whatever they're making cheaper. And so
and just to make this explicit, the term we've been talking about is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, the rate of profit to decline. But it's called a tendency. And so Marx recognizes that over the long term, there's this, and Marx, Smith, Ricardo, they notice there's this tendency within the logic of capitalism for a general rate of profit to fall. However, there are counteracting tendencies. And so, as you're talking about, you can lower wages, you could increase the working day, you can globalize production and take advantage of lower wage workers in other countries.
Or to get more historical with it, one way to think about the Civil War is the South wanting to supercharge their version of export-based commodity capitalism in the plantation system with the lowest cost labor you can, which is free. And also a bunch of land that was also pretty much free once we had dispossessed the indigenous peoples who lived there originally. Like the entire American
it puts a real spin on the exploratory European project when you think about it as a means of finding new labor, new resources to exploit.
In order to like try to lower either their labor costs or their material costs in order to produce the commodities that they buy or that they produce and then sell for a profit. Because producing stuff, selling for a profit, this is the capitalist mode of production, and that's the important thing to keep yourself grounded in. Because that is the problem, and the reason it's a problem
is the name of the game.
It's because it's not sustainable, and because it leads to a lot of really nasty things. Because those wars and colonialism, and I would add that racism itself, like as a scientific construct, that this is what capitalism does. It needs it, like the ideology that it produces, to reinforce these relationships between between the different actors and pieces of the mode of production that it's engaged in, right? I hope this is not sounds too batshit to anyone, but I really wanted to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's the value in kind of thinking about it in those historical terms, because it's this like this it's high school level history. Why was there this urge to expand? Why was there this urge to explore? Well, cheaper resources, new resources that other countries hadn't already colonized or taken advantage of. And what does that allow? Well, it allows cheaper. There you go.
There's also a problem where, let's say, the capitalist class succeeds, and they do win the class struggle, and they do bid down wages really, really as low as they can, and they, successfully exploit advances in technology to get supply chains and better, cheaper inputs into their system of commodity capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. If they do all that, they run into something that even like Keynesians would be familiar with, which is that, like, as this would happen over time, because the wage class is also supposed to be consuming. Once their wages are bid down to a certain level, like, they're not going to be enough buyers in that market for a product, and so the only solution then is to either eat it, which they'll never want to do, or to find new markets. But again, like, at this point in our history on this planet, like, there are no new markets. Like, there are no hidden peoples beneath Antarctica to sell to, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and so we'll eventually get there as the kind of the Marxist analysis of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall plays itself out. Um, but in the historical literature, what you tend to see is that the actual like empirical data shows this all playing out. But there's this very short term where people within the theoretical literature are like, and I'm thinking of someone like Okashiko right now, who I'm not really going to get too deep into, but he doesn't think that tendency of the rate of profit to fall works until Japanese markets open up, and then when they open up, you start to see, oh, there's a shift in the rate of profit. I'm talking about like the 60s here when this occurred. But yeah, as new markets open up, as new markets develop, you see this trend take over.
and the main point I would like to make about a lot of the people who say that either this doesn't exist or it does, but it's not really a problem, it's solvable, is that, historically speaking, from what I can tell, everyone who's marshaled facts in opposition to the idea that this means capitalism isn't sustainable as a mode of production has relied on, as accurate and voluminous as they are, too small a time frame of figures in too small an area in order to prove Marx wrong, to own this guy over the tendency of related profit to fall. And I guess
Yeah.
that is as fine a way as it is introducing our next character in this, because before I wrap up with just Marx's basic analysis on this, which is there is definitely more to it, and if you're interested to go look into it, please. But the important thing to remember is that this
And I think
means
it's
that,
worth just real quickly. I
no,
think at
please
this
go.
stage, I think it's worth thinking of it almost as an intuition that there is this kind of internal logic to capitalism, and it may not trend in a given year that way, but in the long term, it is going to trend that way, and that's the intuition that Marx is putting in there.
And this has really serious and revolutionary implications for humanity, because what it means is that, like, this system isn't sustainable, and whatever else you want to say about what he thinks comes after that, which we will go into maybe a little bit at the end, that remains a fact. At least so says I, and so says Kenny, and so says many a Marxist today. But back in the day, there were plenty of people who said no, this is not true, and they were socialists, or at least they'd say they were. And one of them, who was pretty influential and important at the time, was a guy named Edward Bernstein. He was a German politician and familiar with Engels and Marx during their lifetime, but began to break away from them over, this issue, the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. And what Bernstein did, and he was, as lame as what I'm about to tell you is and sounds, it was very convincing to a lot of people at the time. So convincing, in fact, that it was probably the dominant way of thinking on the socialist left in the developed world. But it basically boiled down to Marx is wrong about the tendency for the rate of profit to decline. He's wrong about this general trend towards consolidation, or at least he's wrong that it can't be stopped. And here is a giant book of facts and figures and tables and the land ownership and estate size in Germany over decades, and et cetera, that proves, Bernstein says no, this is not true. And because it's not true, we don't need a revolution. What we need is to get power in parliament and to organize through the trade union movement, as opposed to like a militant globalized labor movement. Go ahead, man.
And I think that's really worth underlining the idea that Marx presents this critique of capitalism, and he presents it with a political project. And so as people go back and forth on these issues, they are not only presenting an economic analysis, they're also presenting their own political projects that underlie them. So if capitalism isn't prone to collapse, well, then what's the political goal? And for Bernstein, that's this idea of a managed capitalism, that we can full-heartedly take the reins and actually manage capitalist development in such a way, for in his mind, and I'll give him his due, this belief that once we take control of it, then we've taken control of our productive lives and ourselves as a species.
And I would say that, like, what's kind of fascinating to me is that today we have people who fight over electoralism and how valid it is, and and I think the answer depends on like at what level you're talking about, because obviously, like, if anyone's trying to get me to like vote for the most socialisty candidate at the presidential level right now, I'm just like, I have no time for that, right? Like there, I don't see the opening there, the cycle. Sorry,
but it is very much a, like, the more things change, the more they stay the same, because
it really is.
This is the perennial debate. Like we call it like electoralism versus direct action now, but
and I think a lot of
same
people
thing as it was in World War I.
And a lot of people who argue about it now and then, frankly, were arguing from a place where they had personal stakes in it, right? Like Bernstein has an incredibly personal stake in whether or not the electoral process is worth participating in, or whether like capitalism really is doomed and needs a revolutionary act to abolish it, because like he's in a political party and trying to like run for office and stuff, I think. I also
and that's another thing of like, well, kind of as you put it, what's the stakes of the person making the argument? And I think from someone like Bernstein's position, historical record being what it is, I don't super agree with Bernstein, but it makes sense from his position of, well, what can I do in this situation? And if I can offer a political project of managed capitalism, well, that's something we can do.
And I would say, like, if it sounds like I'm being a little hard on him, I maybe I am, but one thing that I've literally learned like today, before I was doing a bit of reading before this, is that he put out a volume of some of Marx's work where it was like specifically edited to sound less
Yeah.
revolutionary.
Yeah. Oh god, I kind of forgot about that. Yeah, Bernstein was a
Yeah.
classic, and like, hey, I'm gonna reintroduce a volume of Marx and cut out all the pieces that are not super helpful to my political project.
So like the thing is like even though he's not, I don't agree with him. You know, I also don't think like he was necessarily like, you know, crazy for investigating or trying to like marshal facts on this issue, because like it is an important question and it deserves, you know, pulling apart. And if you can try to disprove it, then
Yeah.
like you should. But when you're doing shit
I
like,
also
you
think
know,
I also think if you're gonna actually like give him his historical credit or his historical due, he presented a uh, a kind of Marxism that persists to this day. The idea of a managed capitalism, we use different terminology for it, but that's a very attractive idea to a lot of people.
yeah, the idea that like we don't need to bother with thinking about or imagining or working towards any sort of revolution in any way. And by that I don't mean like, you know, necessarily like a violent revolution or anything like that. And it would need to be like partly political, I think. But really, I when I say revolution, I also mean in the sense of say computers are revolutionary to our way of life. A revolution in the terms of our way of life, but even deeper than
Yeah.
like just technology adoption, you know, literally like the relationship between and the goal of the forces of production, I'd say. But we need to move on from Bernstein because he sucks. I'm sorry. Distant Peasant Podcast verdict: Bernstein sucks. Tried to own Marx. Got owned yourself. Engels caught you
I
editing his
honestly,
shit.
we've probably given more credit to Bernstein than he's gotten in the past 20 years.
Probably like he's, you know, one thing a lot of most Marxist
for,
groups
for,
do.
for a lot of Marxists, Bernstein is that guy that Luxemburg and Lenin just really hated during World War One. That's like the extent they know him.
It's people talk about leftist infighting a lot, but if it, you know, anybody basically is like looked into this on the left at all is pretty unified. They're Peter Bernstein, which is not good.
One of my old jokes was, oh yeah, people talk about leftist infighting. Could you imagine Twitter existing during World War One? Like, for anybody who knows anything about like socialist historiography, like World War One was literally every leftist calling each other dipshits. And if you just could imagine them all on Twitter at the same time, it would be amazing. It would be so much pettier than anything you've ever seen before.
Someone who strikes me as like maybe not so petty, but would definitely be a posting warrior, but also like a real warrior, because we're about to talk about a real one. Because it's going to be a while before there's really any effective pushback, I'd say, against Bernstein, as ridiculous as I've made him sound. A few here and there.
We're both being unfair and too fair. It's very weird.
I'm probably too concerned with being a little even-handed. People like it when you just, you know, are provocative. I should just. Bernstein was an asshole. Fuck him. But one person who also
I'm saying it right now. I'm saying it right now, Jeff. Edward Bernstein, canceled. Done with
canceled. We are done with him. He's never allowed to post again. But even if he wasn't, like one person who owned shit out of him worse off than you or I ever could. And they did it in a way that, you know, very cruelly took him seriously and then absolutely demolished his shit. Was a woman named Rosa Luxemburg, who probably deserves an entire episode series on her herself. But she's not going to get one today. But she was a real one, folks. She was a real one in more than one way too, because she was a real academic, real smart lady, and also
first woman to be officially an economist.
Yes, and a real serious political revolutionary who risked life and limb and was indeed caught and executed. Before she was able to live a full life.
Killed by Bernie Sanders himself.
Yep, Bernie Sanders rolled up in to Poland, was like, "I've come for you. You're not parliamentary enough. Well, Eugene V. Debs rules." I don't know, I don't know what he would say, but the thing about Rosa and the tendency for the rate of profit to decline is that she makes an excellent point, both because she's really smart, but also because of who she is and her identity. She was born to a Jewish family in Poland, and we've talked a little bit about colonialism. And I don't know about you, Katie, but when I think about colonialism, I think about overseas activity a lot because I think about like colonial America as opposed to the United Kingdom, or even America in our we don't really have that many real colonies or territories overseas, but we do have many client states, right?
Yeah, the nature of colonialism has changed from the 19th century British model to a more economic economic territory model.
Because it is also possible to colonize parts of your own domestic population or parts of your continent or your country or people inside of a country. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be far away from you.
So can I go off on this for just a second?
Sure.
This actually this isn't super related to our conversation about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall or decline, but it's something that Marx introduces as I guess you could think about it as like a mind wave, uh, that capitalism is a self-disciplining economic system. And what I mean by that is that as it's introduced, as capitalism spreads across the globe, it disciplines wherever it lands to work by its own logic. And so this is kind of what he means by in the Communist Manifesto when he talks about all ancient traditions and rights are kind of washed away from it. Because what he's trying to say is that as capitalism is introduced to new territories, it begins to discipline people to behave by its logic. So, where places where wage labor didn't exist, well, now it exists. And whatever the cultural context or history of that nation or that culture is, gets disciplined into capitalism. And I think that is a really easy way for a lot of people to understand when they talk about decolonization theory or colonization theory across the globe. Capitalism, as it was developed by Western Europe, worked its way backwards to destroy all cultural values, all cultural systems, and make it work to its own logic.
And I think what Marx would say, and what any decent Marxist would say, is that like these ideologies, a lot of times we mock them maybe on this podcast and in our lives. We think they're silly, and like, oh, that's fine, really, because and they're confused. They don't seem to make any sense. But these do develop like for a reason, and the reason they develop is to reinforce the system where it needs reinforcement. Just like feudalism itself, when it was a mode of production, introduced values of fealty and loyalty and piety and a worldview based on the Catholic Church, et cetera, et cetera. Like all these things, they weren't just like flowers that grew out of human thought because they were pretty. They were, tools. They've developed like with a purpose for the system to reinforce its own integrity because it has beneficial effects for that way of doing things anyway.
And I know we're kind of off on a tangent here, but that was what Marx saw as so revolutionary about capitalism, that it was capable by its internal logic, without needing to have a top-down approach to do it, to have people essentially wipe away the old class system of feudalism, to get rid of the dukes, the lords, the Ellingtons, the whatever, the sirs, and just have it exist as a marketplace. He thought that was a truly revolutionary thing, and that was happening organically. It didn't take somebody abolishing it. It didn't take a self-conscious ideology to do it. It just wiped it away. And he thought that was something truly revolutionary about a system that he also thought was deeply dangerous and evil.
Couldn't agree more. But getting back to Rosa and the colonialism, uh, like I was saying, it is possible for this phenomenon not just to be like manifest in low-wage countries who where the productive capacity is located for multinational corporations. It can also be within a known nation, i.e., like I would say, the immigrant community in the United States, the undocumented community in the United States. They are part of an underclass, super exploited labor class still, as are people
The
of color,
treatment of
black people.
H-1B, the treatment of H-1B visas.
Yes, those people too from overseas who come here to work, uh, as well as traditionally black people. Absolutely, of course, legacy of slavery. People who listen to this podcast are familiar with my takes on this. It's bad, folks. I hate it. But for Rosa, it could also be like Polish Jewry, right? Or even Poland itself. and she felt, I think, in her heart, a lot of solidarity and justice, and wrote about it with other oppressed peoples of the world, including the black people of America, and also the other Polish people where she lived. But Rosa Luxemburg did a pretty invaluable service in before being executed for being awesome, um, tearing apart Bernstein's idea. Exactly. And she really kicks off this idea that first of all, Bernstein, what you've done is like, your data set's flawed. Okay. Like you haven't proved what you said you would. And also you've missed a lot of really important stuff, which is the degree to which the state, which is really a creation of the bourgeois, i.e. the capitalist class, more than anything else, because Marx.
I think Marx described them at one point as the board of directors for the bourgeois class.
I mean, Marx makes a point, and it's undeniable that the modern state arises at precisely the same time as capitalism does. Like, just as the feudal order is breaking down, like here is this new thing. Like, it's not a coincidence. But in any case, I think like Rosa pointed out the degree to which, like, yeah, if you just look inside your own country, and everything seems fine. Like, yeah, this isn't really a thing. Like, we can work around it or whatever.
Yeah.
If you even look just a little bit a ways, and in Europe, like, you could just look across the land at Poland, and you can see how, like, no, actually, this process is actually just going to get worse because in a quest to deny or escape or mitigate the tendency for the rate of profit to decline in an industry, they will subjugate as many people as they can, as long as they can. Yep. And for this reason, like, a revolutionary act is necessary in order to break this mode.
It is funny because it almost seems quaint at this point to have that thought, but like, yeah, she was the one who took this and basically asked the question, well, okay, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall or decline within a given marketplace, we can see that's occurring. But what happens if capitalism starts expanding outside of that one marketplace? And it's almost a quaint idea, but she takes that to its logical conclusion.
And its logical conclusion basically results in a massive increase in the exploitation of not just people, but I've mostly, because of just the nature of the show, we haven't talked too much about the environmental effects of this either, but it's worth pointing out that as capitalism progresses, also it will continue to require energy inputs. It will continue to require material inputs in terms of ore, rare earth metals, et cetera, to make all the things that we like. And this process is destructive in bad ways.
But it's really important to go back into what we talked a bit ago with Bernstein of okay, what's the political project in mind? Because these are never just standalone economic analysis. Um, for Rosa Luxemburg, one thing that she's working on is she's trying to give a Marxist, she's trying to give a socialist take in the context of World War One. And so what she's trying to explain is one, why World War One is happening, and two, why working people need to not buy into the both the capitalist and state ideologies that allow World War One to take place. So she's trying to give an account that both takes account of the economic analysis, why is this happening, while at the same time giving an internationalism that people can take hold of and say, oh, we actually don't need to be going to war. Going to war is just a byproduct of the capitalist contradictions working themselves out.
And it's funny that you mentioned going to war and the political project, because it brings us to the one of the final two. But guys, we're going to talk about today. Yeah, we're going back to the fellas. Sorry, Miss Rosa. But she was fantastic, actually, and perhaps I'll do a deeper dive on her later. But it's with another
infinitely, I would say this about just before
ahead,
we
please.
put that pin in it. Infinitely more readable than Marx.
Oh, so much better.
She writes fire.
I mean, yeah, it may just be because she wrote much later or a little bit later. I don't know. But yeah, she's a much, much, much better writer. And what I really like about her writing and the way she talks about this stuff and analyzes it, it's a great fusion of a sort of like, you know, rigorous thinking, very sophisticated analysis, but also like a deep
with
and
that
abiding
polemical spirit.
Yes, and a deep and abiding passion for justice and humanity to win the day. Like,
and just because now my mind is thinking about it, I find Bernstein to be a complete slog to read, because so much of his writing is him selectively quoting Marx and saying, "Hey, well, Marx said a thing, and I agree with it, and therefore the working class needs to agree with my take because Marx also said it." Rosa is actually producing what we would call new content. She's actually integrating new analysis. She's bringing new data sets in and really integrating them into a new economic analysis that, I'm sorry, Bernstein, canceled. Not good.
Yeah, read Marx. Watch out for Capital. If it's a little dense for you, don't be intimidated or feel bad, because I find it difficult. Definitely don't even bother with Bernstein. Definitely read Rosa. She's fantastic. But I would say for the next guy we're about to talk about, I have to say unironically that people really should read him, and I actually really do like him a lot. I don't always agree with everything he says, and he's also a really good writer.
He's a lot of fun to read.
He's an excellent writer, although he's if you thought Rosa Luxemburg had a hard edge, let me introduce you to Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin.
Yeah.
And the way Lenin would put it about all of this is I read a quote.
And real quick, right before we get into it, it's also worth noting that Lenin is developing his own, essentially alongside Rosa Luxemburg. Luxemburg dies a few years before Lenin does, but they're both writing polemics roughly at the same time, and they're both shitting on Bernstein. So
yeah, it brings the left together. But the quote goes something like this, and I may be getting it slightly wrong, but there is no such thing as a hopeless situation for the capitalists. The capitalists will always find a way out, even if it takes a war to get there. And this is sort of an extension of, or maybe just a rephrasing of Rosa Luxemburg's point, which is that we can't rely, if we're looking to talk about like what should we do as a political project to remedy the situation that we agree is a problem, we can't rely on the system to just evolve itself out of it, because, as Lenin would put it, the capitalist system will not hesitate to fight a war in order to escape this problem. And I've talked about war as a sort of like aggressive imperial or colonialist act, and that is one way that it can occur, and it can lower the labor costs and resource costs for your mode of production. But you can also just fight a war to burn off this productive capacity and sort of set the system back a bit. Because war is both incredibly destructive and incredibly accelerating as a process of capitalism.
So if we go back to the idea of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, Marx actually does present what is essentially an algebraic expression of this, like an equation essentially. And one of the implications of that is, okay, so constant capital, essentially technology means production, is constantly replacing what he calls living labor, it's human workers. So what happens if you just remove constant capital from the equation? And you know what's really good at destroying constant capital and removing it from an equation?
Atomic weapons.
A war. It's actually really good at just destroying things and needing people to rebuild it.
And this brings me to like a sort of horrifying realization, or it should, I think, bring people to this, which is that it's not right to say that capitalism will abolish itself, but it is right to say that capitalism will abolish itself eventually, I think, in some ways, because it is very possible that it could just, abolish us backwards into a vastly reduced mode of production, and where we go back to there not being any factories, and if you need something you make it where you live.
And again, going back to this idea of what's the political project underlying the analysis, I think both Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin are actually essentially coming to a very similar conclusion, which is that in a moment of crisis, the working class needs to take control, needs to take the reins, and be very self-conscious about taking that control. They're coming at it from two completely different political directions, because for Rosa Luxemburg, she sees it as a term that gets thrown around a lot, but like a spontaneous working class moment. Whereas you have the classical Leninist tradition of you need a political party that acts as a vanguard that is aware of these things and is able to do them. And they're coming at it from two very different political positions, but the end result is essentially the same. This idea that a self-conscious working class takes the reins of the productive process at capitalism's moment of crisis.
And I mean, I think in terms of how they view exactly like the particulars of what needs to happen, Vanguard Party versus democratically administered, but like what does that look like? People sometimes accuse Luxemburg of being a bit vague or ambiguous about some of this stuff, and I don't really know for sure. What I do know for sure, though, is that these questions were, for them, had
existential.
And they had real world.
One of them literally died for it.
I mean, they had real world consequences for their answers, right? In terms of like what they could do, and because like Lenin actually like won his revolution, for example. We shouldn't forget that like a lot of his thinking was based on what was happening at the time.
And I think we can both safely bracket the historical and political questions of like, no, who was right and who was justified in this or that context. I think both of us are kind of less interested in that than talking about one, this concept of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall or decline, and also the political questions that are born out of it. Because as you can kind of see in our discussion of Marx and our discussion of Bernstein, Luxemburg, and Lenin, you start to see these very different approaches of, okay, what if we do a kind of reformism? What if we try to manage capitalism? What if we try a revolutionary project? What does that revolutionary project have to look like? You can start to see how these things are all uh, deeply connected.
And I do just want to say that, I consider myself, I say I'm a socialist. I just don't usually bother appelling democratic to the front of it, because why bother? Like, if your socialism is not democratic, then what the fuck are you doing? But, I do find myself on the democratic side of things, as opposed to the other side. There are slurs for this that you may refer to based on if it's in Hungary, I think later, but but what I think, like Lenin, Luxemburg, and myself all agree is that because of this, the abolition of capitalism as a mode of production will need to be a conscious act. And there will,
Yeah.
it will happen.
It's not going to accidentally fail itself out of existence.
No, because if I've already described like what that would look like, we don't want that. I guarantee you, because it would be the death of billions.
And for listeners of this podcast, me and Jeff were kind of talking before this, and I agreed to not necessarily go down this route, but I would like to toss it out there. For a lot of Marxists, the fallout of the Great Depression and the rise of Nazi Germany was this kind of existential question of, well, how can capitalism just fail and then turn into fascism? And I think that's a question that should always be on our minds as we think about self-consciously changing things.
And that brings me to like really the final segment that I wanted to touch on, because hopefully people could see what I'm getting at. Because the Great Depression, stock market crash 29, oil shocks in the 70s,
which is weird to think that Lenin was dead at this point.
I mean, that the financial crisis in 2008 and the current pandemic, all of these, I remember growing up and learning about them and reading about them, even as an adult too. They're all kind of described as exogenous events that occur that disrupt the world, disrupt society, that we then respond to, and that are not the fault of the system under which we operate. Because, for example, like there will be collapse in demand for some reason or another occasionally, because there's things like natural disasters, right? Or overproduction that a Keynesian would say, like, you just need to manage demand or whatever. To that I say, like, that's never happening, never going to happen, so fuck off. But precisely like in this moment, I used to think that way, and now I view not I don't view capitalism's terrible response to the pandemic as a failure of capitalism to respond to a natural disaster.
Sure.
I actually view it more as like the natural disaster just accelerating, exposing, making worse, exacerbating all of the flaws of the system that already existed, right?
It's heightening the contradictions.
Like, it's not like before the pandemic hit, the fucking economy was great, that wages were super up, that people were feeling good about, their future. They weren't. We were continuing to be, immiserated, exploited. Companies continue to gain power in our political system and in terms of like absolute market share. Like it was a nightmare, and this has just made things worse. And it's made it worse in like ways that people can really grasp easily. Like,
yeah.
I mean, there's always more to say about Lenin, but
that's the thing is like, yeah, I could go on rants, but also like whatever, I guess.
But we've been through plenty, and I just wanted to give a move. I stand with Lenin, guys. I stand with Lenin. No, I mean, but I do think he's right about this.
I think it's good to tease it.
And that the mode of production, like, it will need to be consciously abolished. And that conscious abolition, to me, that constitutes a revolutionary act, and that means that revolution is necessary. It doesn't necessarily need to be super violent or violent at all, but it will be like messy, certainly. The thing is that like we don't have a choice because we're either going to figure out how to produce for human use and human need, right? And I know the Soviets didn't do a great job at that, but we can perhaps do a bit better, right?
Well, also, like, if you put yourself in the historical context of what are the option sets at the time? Rosa Luxemburg is offering, I guess, what people would call a more democratic, what a lot of Marxists like to call spontaneous organization of the working class, and she gets assassinated. She gets got by Bernie Sanders. He literally shot her in the street. Um, and whereas Lenin is offering this, yes, more hierarchical, but effective means of achieving that. And I'm not really here to settle that debate. I don't like, to be honest, don't super care. But I think it's worth keeping those political questions in mind. That's underlying their economic analysis, and they both kind of come to the same conclusion that as capitalism spreads, it's going to need to globalize because that's the only way to keep the rate of profit
Yes.
maintained.
It's the only way to escape this tendency for the rate of profit to decline. But like whether or
As
not
Luxemburg put it, it was socialism or barbarism, and the context of her saying barbarism was World War One.
Yeah, and if you think like we can't, if the weapons then the weapons of World War One are really underappreciated by us today because we think like, oh, old timey machine guns and the first tanks that look like shit and could go 7 miles an hour. Who was fucking afraid of any of that? But that war like literally changed the world and millions of people's lives.
I mean, you had children, you had children breathing in toxic gases in trenches filled with dead bodies, causing gangrene.
It was the first worldwide industrialized warfare, and so like it was really bad. And then we fought another war with even better weapons after that ended in the complete destruction of 2 cities in Japan through nuclear weapons. And the next war, if it does happen, maybe we'll get lucky and it won't be with nukes, but
what was
something else.
What was the 50 years following that? It was the Soviet Union versus the United States, and at any moment, both sides were constantly trying to convince each other they could wipe each other out with nukes.
But for our current moment, like, what this question, how it reveals itself, I think, is that like we the productive capacity to make masks, distribute them to people who need them as a public health matter, we can't do that as a country. Our system won't allow that. Like all we can figure out how to do is like, okay, well, how can we subsidize a market process for people to get masks? Like that's all our public sphere and our society is capable of doing. And it's revealing itself in the fact that the biggest companies at this moment, the biggest restaurant chains that are able to ride out the slump in demand, they're the ones who are consolidating. Billionaires are growing richer because of this phenomenon, even as like demand in this country for goods and services absolutely fucking plummets, right? Like, and like this will keep happening until it can't anymore. And that moment, like when it can't anymore, whether it collapses up or down is the question, right? And we want up.
Can I share a Marx quote that I think
Absolutely.
I think it brings this all full circle and really highlights. We're talking about the rate of profit to fall. We're talking about these historical figures, but I think this is the through line of what we're really trying to say. And it's this quote from Marx. It's from Wage, Labor, and Capital. What distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this: that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. And at the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. He not only effects a change of form in the material on which he works, but he also realizes a purpose of his own that gives the law to his modus operandi, in which he must subordinate his will. Basically, the broad point there being, we create the world in which we live, and if we want to create a world other than capitalism, we have to take some control over that.
You need to dream before you can live it. I think that about does it, Kentucky Fried Comrade. I appreciate your time today. I really enjoyed talking about Marxian economics with somebody.
Oh, I could go on for hours and hours, but it was a pleasure, buddy.
We'll do some more sometime.
I hope so. Thanks, man.